Thanks for tuning in for another teaching on church history. Today, I want to share with you some not so trivial trivia about the Reformation. Not so trivial trivia. I was just going to call it trivia, but it's not trivia. It's significant, some of the stuff I'm going to share with you today. But where I got this was, I've taken quite a few courses on the Reformation and so forth at a master's level. I've studied it, I've read books. But there's always more. And you can delve into anything, any area of history and just discover reams of other stuff that you didn't know before. And that's the way it has been with me since I've been studying and teaching church history. Somebody asks a question or whatever, and it prompts me to study a little more, to dig a little deeper, to go in a different direction. And you just find out all kind of stuff that you didn't know before. So this whole little teaching that I'm going to give you now is just a bunch of different stuff I didn't know before. And like I say, I call it not so trivial trivia because it really played a role. But I never heard this stuff before. So let me just get started here. I found out some more about the Holy Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Emperor when the Reformation first started, which was a guy named Charles V. And I really didn't know that much about the Holy Roman Empire. So I studied more about the territory of it and the leaders and so forth and the history. And I found out, that Charles V was actually Habsburg from Austria. He spoke German, but then he became the King of Spain and so on. And so he had to learn Spanish. And he spoke like 5 or 6 languages. But he's the guy who was emperor of the area where Martin Luther lived when he started off the Reformation. And Charles V is the one who called or demanded that this monk, Martin Luther, come to what was called the Diet of Worms. It looks like the Diet of Worms, but it's a legal proceeding that was held in 1521. That's where Luther was put on trial for his supposedly radical revolutionary views and statements against the Pope and against the Roman Catholic Church. And so some of the articles that I read on this mentioned the difficulties that Charles V was confronting at this time. And I found those very enlightening because I wondered why, he didn't just crush Luther right away and get rid of him. But there were a lot of things that kept him from doing that. And that also taught me a lot of things about the way in which the Reformation came to England and some of the difficulties the Pope at that time was facing. So I began studying all this, and I just want to share these things with you. First of all, I didn't know that Charles V was the grandson of Ferdinand II of Aragon. He's the king who married Queen Isabella of Castile, which, today Spain is all these kingdoms united, but back then they were separate kingdoms. So Ferdinand II married Queen Isabella, and I'm sure you've heard of those two, because they're the ones that authorized the voyages of Christopher Columbus when he discovered America. And I didn't know that Charles V's mother was a woman named Joanna, and she was said to be insane, mad. And his father, Charles V's father, was a Habsburg. He was the son of Maximilian I, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. And that's why Charles V, who is also known as Charles I of Spain, this gets very complicated because he was the first Charles, Carlos, el primer Carlos, right, in Spain. But he's the 5th in terms of being the Holy Roman Empire. And he ruled over both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, which included Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany today, and various other areas of Europe there. It was an empire that expanded and contracted over the years. It included the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium, as well as parts of today's Germany, northern Italy, Austria, and other parts of Europe as well. I didn't know either that Charles V inherited problems with the King of France, who during his time was Francis I of France. And those two monarchs were constantly battling with one another over their various territories, some of which happened to be in northern Italy. And so as they battled over territories of northern Italy, their conflicts caused the Pope to get involved because he tried to bring peace, to be a peacemaker there between these two warring Christian kings. And the Pope's efforts to bring peace ended up causing Charles V to actually march on Rome because he didn't like what the Pope was doing. And he took the Pope prisoner for a period of about 6 months. So that Pope at that time was Clement VII. And so he was thrown in jail by Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And he actually had to eventually escape after some time in jail there. He disguised himself as a beggar. This is the kind of stuff that you see in movies, and I'm sure there probably is one that I've never seen, but there's probably a movie out there about this because this is good movie material. Now, it was about this same time, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in another video, but it's about this same time, you see, that Henry VIII of England wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And Catherine of Aragon is what's today Spain, right? So that was an arranged marriage. His dad arranged the marriage with Catherine and Henry VIII's older brother. But the older brother died. And so Henry I guess it was the seventh, he wanted to continue this alliance with Spain. So he arranged it to where Catherine would pass on to become the wife of the younger brother who had died. And so Henry VIII was forced to marry her, I believe, when he was 10 years old. And so then when he grew up and then they consummated the marriage and everything, and she didn't give him a male heir, he wanted the Pope to annul the marriage. And the grounds for annulling it in his mind was the fact that this marriage should have never been in the first place because she was married, she was older than him, and she was married to his older brother, and that, was an arranged marriage. And so he didn't want that. And so Henry VIII sent this appeal to the Pope, Clement VII, to annul his marriage, which was kind of a normal sort of thing that a lot of times popes would do. You understood that these monarchs needed a male heir and so forth to bring stability and keep the dynasty going and so forth. So they would often do something like that, annul the marriage. There's no children, so you can annul it. But can you imagine his appeal, Henry VIII's appeal, comes to Clement VII, and Clement's in jail, or he's just gotten out of jail, where he was put by the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V. Well, guess what? Charles V happened to be the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. This stuff, this is better than any movie, right? She was his aunt, or as some of you say, aunt, right? Catherine of Aragon was Charles V's aunt. And so, Charles V had imprisoned the Pope. So now Henry asks him to annul the marriage that he has with this guy's aunt. And so the Pope is not about to do that. He's not feeling real inclined to grant the King of England's request to annul his marriage to Catherine because her nephew has put him in prison. And he's already made him mad several times, and he doesn't want to make him mad anymore. So as a result of that difficulty that was going on, Henry ended up breaking with the Roman Catholic Church. And that is what initiated the formation or the initiation of what's called today the Church of England. The Anglican Church, or in America it's called the Episcopal Church. So that was kind of the trivia, the not so trivial trivia background there. Now, I also learned this. Charles V was a devout Catholic. And he hated Luther. He hated everything Luther stood for. He saw him as an outlaw who was trying to wreck the unity of his empire and of the Holy Catholic Church. And so Charles V wanted to get rid of Luther. And I kind of understood that. I kind of thought that, but I wondered why he never did it. Well, the reason he didn't do it was because of this not so trivial trivia, this background information. You see, it turns out Luther was under the protection of German princes, right? Frederick III, the Elector, saved him and so forth. We talked about that in an earlier video. So these German princes were protecting Luther. And guess what? Charles spoke German. He was an Austrian, but he spoke German, and he was more in league or more in had more to of relation with the Germans. So he needed them, and they were for Luther. So he hated Luther. He wanted to get rid of him, but he couldn't because he needed the approval of the German princes. And the Germans, meanwhile, they were very tired of having Rome exercise so much authority over their lands and their finances. They were tired of having to send money to Rome, like to have them build a St. Peter's Basilica or whatever. They were tired of them meddling in their local affairs. And so when Luther came along and said, you know what, we don't have to obey the Roman Catholic Church anymore, that suited the German princes and leadership just fine, because they didn't want to have to submit to the Pope anymore or the Roman Catholic Church. They didn't want to have to send money to them anymore to build St. Peter's Basilica or whatever. They were sick of that. They wanted to keep it local. So I was amazed to learn some of that trivia. And also, when I discovered the complicated problems both Charles V and Clement VII were facing during those times, I tell you what, I thought I had problems. But when I read about these guys, I realized my problems are very minor by comparison. For one thing, imagine the difficulties that arose when the Reformation came about. I mean, the church had been one church for more than 1,000 years. And now all of a sudden you got all this breakup and this seeming rebellion and this disunity in the church. And the church was something that had kept Europe together, right? And so if you have this disunity in the church, you're threatening not just the church, but the political unity of all of Europe. Wars are breaking out all over the place. And, they had a 30 years war. We talked about that, I think, in one of the previous videos. So Charles V, he wanted desperately to unify these religious factions that were fighting. And he called for the colloquy of Regensburg in 1541. I talked about that in an earlier video. He tried to bring the Catholics and the Protestants back together, but it just wasn't possible. The cat was out of the bag. There was too much biblical knowledge now. There was just too many details that just couldn't be worked out. But meanwhile, check this out. Not only did he have this disunity within the one Roman Holy Catholic Church of his entire empire, he also faced a terrifying threat from the Ottoman Turks in his eastern territories. The Ottoman Turks were a terrifying threat. They had invaded. They'd gotten all the way to Budapest in Hungary. They had been a threat really for hundreds of years. They'd taken over all of the Middle East, and they were moving up into Europe. They got all as far as Vienna. And so he's facing a tremendous threat there. Not only that, but the King of France, as I mentioned earlier, the King of France is always clashing with him, seeking to battle with him and take territory from him. He had a tremendous financial burden to maintain mercenary troops. He had armies, and some of the Spanish troops were crack troops. They're the best in the world at that time, but you have to pay them to do their work. They're mercenaries. And so, of course, he's getting a lot of silver and gold from the New World, but he's spending all his money on these mercenary troops to maintain order and fight rebellions and bring peace all over the place. So he just wants these religious people to get along, and at first he, like the Pope, kind of thought this was just a squabble among monks. And so it's like, for crying out loud, will you people just get over your differences and solve the problem here? Because I got bigger, issues, and I need you to not be fighting over all this religious doctrine and so forth. So he wanted them to get along. And he would have just executed Luther, as I said. I believe he probably would have just executed him, but he couldn't because he's under the protection of those German princes, and Charles needed them to get along. So he had clashes. He'd had clashes with the popes and with the Catholic Church, even though he was a devout Catholic. He'd taken the Pope prisoner for a while. He's facing the King of France, the trouble there, and he's facing the Ottoman Turks. So this is amazing to me. And guess what happened? This is amazing. So Francis I, King of France, is so wanting to take over, to defeat Charles V and gain his territory for France, that he actually allied himself with the Turks. And their sultan, his name at that time was Suleiman the Magnificent. And so I believe he's the guy that changed the Hagia Sophia over to the Blue Mosque as it is today in Istanbul. But anyway, Suleiman the Magnificent was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and Francis I made an alliance with this Turk, with this Muslim, in order to defeat his opponent there, who was another Christian king. Can you imagine? The Muslims had come all the way to Budapest, Hungary. Their pirates were raiding the Spanish coasts, and that's where Charles V, he was king of Spain. They threatened Italy, and they ruled basically the whole Eastern Mediterranean. You couldn't travel through there because the Muslim pirates ruled that area. So it was no small threat. So what's Charles do, this Christian monarch, to fight Francis I, who's a Christian monarch allied with Muslims? What does Charles do? He allies himself with Henry VIII of England, but also with the Safavid Empire of Persia, which is Iran today. So he makes contact with another Muslim empire and asks them to join him in fighting the King of France and the Ottoman Turks, because the Persians hated the Turks. And so you have Muslim and Christian against Muslim and Christian. Amazing. It's amazing, you know. And it was right during that whole time, with all the stuff that he's facing, that Charles calls Luther to the Diet of Worms in 1521. And Luther makes his famous stand. So this is the not so trivial trivia behind the scenes, right? I was also intrigued by things I learned about the popes of this period. The Pope, when Luther first became famous and really kind of launched the Reformation, was Leo X. He was Pope from 1513 to 1521. And Luther so angered Leo X that the Pope excommunicated him. Leo is kind of a character. You read about him. He was said to be quite worldly. And there are even some scholars who say Leo X was homosexual, or that he was a pedophile. So, you know, it's never been proved. And so these things, you know, especially back in history that far back, you know, you get all kind of rumors and stories. Who knows if he really was or not? But Luther went to Rome earlier in his own career, and he talked about the corruption there. And so pedophilia and homosexuality has been a problem in the Roman Catholic Church for a lot of years, believe it or not, sad as it may seem. And we think it's a modern phenomenon, but it's not. It's been around for many, many years. And so Leo X was this worldly guy. Some say he was homosexual, some say he was a pedophile. And, you know, but people criticize him for not stamping out Luther. Why did he not deal definitively with the Reformation early on? But, you know, when you study about it, you find out that, number one, he is the one who actually said this is nothing more than a squabble among monks, or an argument among some monks. And he thought, for crying out loud, I got all these different factions in my church. I need them all to get along. We'll get over this thing. This will blow over. So it seems historically that he didn't really appreciate how serious this was to the Roman Catholic Church. And he just thought it was an argument among the monks. But be that as it may, he did not crush Luther. He did excommunicate him. He did speak against him. He did have a papal bull against him and so on. But he didn't stop the Reformation. Then he died in 1521. And so a man named Adrian VI took over. But he only lasted as Pope from 1522 to 1523. Then he died. And so then the man who became his successor became known as Pope Clement VII. That guy's name is Giulio de' Medici. Giulio de' Medici. So he's from the famous Medici family of Italy. Those are the ones who sponsored all the art and all that stuff, the famous artwork and all of the Renaissance, Renaissance and all that in Italy. So he's one of that family, the Medicis. Okay, Giulio de' Medici. But he became Pope Clement VII. And check this out. Now, he was supposedly of illegitimate birth. Now, nowadays, we don't use those terms and everybody thinks it's horrible and everything, you know, but for hundreds of years, if your mother and father were not married, you were called illegitimate. And so in this case of Clement VII, apparently no one knew who his mother was, or he was adopted out or taken away from her early or something. People didn't know who his mother was. And so it was through some kind of affair that he was born. So technically, legally, he couldn't be Pope because he was illegitimate. However, he was in the Medici family, and they were powerful. And so he was rising up through the ranks in the Catholic Church, and they saw that they would want to use him. He was a rising star. And so they ended up kind of working out a special deal. Pope Leo the Tenth was actually his cousin, and he worked out a special papal dispensation when he was pope that pronounced him legitimate, and so that cleared the way for Clement to be the pope later on. By the way, Clement was supposedly very handsome. He was a talented musician, and he was very brilliant in statesmanship, supposedly. That's what was written about him. He was apparently also very much ahead of his time scientifically, because he, believe it or not, recognized Copernicus's theory that the sun was the center of the solar system 100 years before the rest of the Catholic authorities did. You know, that's a big scandal. People talk about how the church fought science and so forth. It's not really true, but it's true that the authorities did not officially recognize Copernicus's theory, of a heliocentric solar system. They didn't recognize that for 100 more years. But this guy, Clement VII, he recognized it 100 years early. So he was very intelligent, and he was ahead of his time scientifically. He had a lot going for him. But unfortunately, when he came to the papacy, he inherited a terrible set of circumstances and problems. And so I want to read for you a quote that I got from Wikipedia. I don't always recommend Wikipedia, but it's useful as a sort of a entry-level research tool, right? Let me read you this quote about Clement VII. It says, quote, "The complex political situation of the 1520s thwarted Clement's intentions to unify Christendom." See, he wanted to overcome the Reformation and unify the church. But I continue with the quote, "Inheriting the problem of Martin Luther's growing Protestant Reformation in Northern Europe, a vast power struggle in Italy between Europe's two most powerful kings, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and Francis I of France, each of whom demanded that the Pope choose a side, and Turkish invasions of Eastern Europe led by Suleiman the Magnificent, Clement's problems were exacerbated by King Henry VIII of England's contentious divorce, resulting in England breaking away from the Catholic Church, and in 1527, souring relations with Emperor Charles V, leading to the violent sack of Rome, during which the Pope was imprisoned. After escaping confinement in the Castel San Angelo, Clement, with few economic, military, or political options remaining, compromised the churches and Italy's independence by allying with his former jailer, Emperor Charles V. Unquote. So can you imagine all this stuff going on at once? You got England breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. You got the Reformation dividing up the Germans and the Scandinavians and everybody. You got France and the Holy Roman Empire at war. You're locked up in jail. My goodness. It was a rough time. So I guess Europe was a real patent place for those of you who are old enough to remember that show. It's a soap opera. And that's the kind of thing that's going on in Europe. This world has been fallen for a long time, and always sin has been rampant. Both Charles V and Pope Clement VII had overwhelming problems all around them on every kind of front you can imagine. And in case you've ever wished that you were an emperor or a pope, I guess this story kind of shows you that such places or positions of prestige or power are not all they're cracked up to be, eh? Whatever problems we may be facing, I'll dare say they're certainly less daunting than those faced by these men. As for me, I say no thanks. I'll just content myself with obscurity. Thank you very much. I don't want all these problems. Anyway, I just thought you might be interested in some of this not so trivial trivia as a background to the Reformation. It sure adds some detail to what was going on in the period that we've been looking at, and it kind of helps us understand a little bit more why things turned out the way they did. Till next time, may the Lord bless you.